Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the autofocusing issue with the Sony cameras that not a lot of people are even aware of because YouTubers don't ever talk about this problem. Honestly, I had to go through different forums to even see other people who experience the same problem as me. But today we're going to be getting on the bottom of it because I think I have the whole problem figured out. And the main reason why this problem exists isn't even a problem with the autofocusing system on these cameras. It's actually because of a feature that these cameras have that you cannot disable for some reason. First of all, you might either be on one side where you're like, oh my god, I had a bunch of autofocusing issues with my Sony cameras and I didn't know why that was happening. Or you might be like, oh, Sony cameras autofocus perfectly fine. What are you talking about? Now, these autofocusing issues happen mainly if you're using strobe lights. If you're using either continuous lights, like how I'm doing right now to light this scene, or if you're shooting outside using natural light, then this is not really going to be an issue. But this does become an issue with these cameras, either if you have a newer, Sony a7R III that I got right here, or if you get an older camera like the Sony a7 camera. This problem becomes an issue if you're shooting in a lowly lit places, which it doesn't have to be complete darkness. It can just be inside of someone's room, and you're using a closed down aperture. So if you're shooting at f8 or f11 settings, then the cameras pretty much can't autofocus, and I'm going to tell you guys why. So if you're someone who works with strobe lights like me, I do mainly studio fashion photography, and when I'm doing that, the studio is, it's not brightly lit, but it's just it's like a dim room, and we have a bunch of strobe lights set up that have modeling lights on them, but the modeling lights on them aren't the strongest thing. And the main problem I have with this is that this is only a Sony issue. If you're shooting with any other brand, this does not become an actual issue. It's just that Sony has this weird problem that for some reason they don't fix. And this whole thing could be fixed over a firmware update tomorrow. It's the dumbest issue. But let me, first of all, besides stalling, let me tell you guys why, if you're shooting with strobes, these cameras can't autofocus. Okay, so the main reason why this is happening, these cameras, is that because these cameras have this feature called the depth of field preview. So what happens is that when you half press the shutter button on the camera, or if you're using back button autofocus, if you hold that down, the camera starts showing what the depth of field is gonna look like, and it does that by closing down the aperture to whatever the setting you have set to. So if you have it set to f11, the camera closes down the aperture while you're trying to autofocus, which makes so that even if you're shooting in a dimly lit room, it turns into pitch black, and then the camera tries focusing using those settings, which it makes absolutely no sense. Now, depth of field preview is something that, depending on what kind of photography you do, it might be useful. But for stuff like I do, if you're doing fashion photography, if you're doing portraits, headshots, or whatever, you don't really need that feature. So you should be able to just turn it off so it doesn't mess with your autofocus, but you can't do that. Sony, for whatever reason, decided to not let you be able to turn off the depth of field preview, and they also made it so that it's the shutter button or the autofocus button to see what your depth of field looks like. So there is a little bit of a workaround to doing this, but still, let me first demonstrate what the problem is, and then we'll get into how you can overcome this problem somewhat. It's still a problem with the workaround. Okay, so let me demonstrate this. As you guys can see, right now we're focused on the camera right here, right? The camera focuses and it's right here. Now, if I half press the shutter button, as you can see right now, the camera becomes really laggy and the headphone in the background is in focus now. If I take my finger off, this is what it looks like. Because right now, the camera just showing me what it looks like at f1.8. But if I press half hold the shutter button, it goes to f22 because that's what I have it set as. So if I'm trying to autofocus, and it's especially if I'm trying to shoot autofocus using AFC, as you can see, the camera focused for a second, and now it's going crazy because the camera is trying to autofocus with the aperture all the way closed down. Again, as you can see, trying to autofocus. Let's try to autofocus on the headphones, but it's going crazy. It doesn't know how to focus anywhere because it's trying to autofocus with the aperture at f22, and as you can see, you just can't get autofocus. Now the workaround to that is if you set it to AFS, then the autofocus it works okay. It's just not as fast as AFC, and if you need continuous autofocus, if you need continuous autofocus, you just can't really do it if you're shooting at a higher aperture. It's very annoying, and as you can see, it's not a problem with the camera. The autofocus on the camera is perfectly fine, but for some reason you cannot turn off the depth of field preview. And so if you're shooting at a high aperture, you have to change the AFS because AFC does not work if you have your aperture closed down. Now if I change my aperture to 1.8, now AFS obviously works perfectly well, and if we change the AFC, that works perfectly fine too. As you can see, it works perfectly fine. Now, if we could turn off the depth of field preview, then we would be able to set our aperture to whatever we want it, and you could just autofocus without any problems. Because the Sony autofocus is really good, but the problem is that you cannot turn up the depth of field preview. As you can see, this is a really dumb problem, because this is not because of the autofocus on the Sony cameras isn't good. If anything, it's probably one of the best autofocusing systems right now, competing with the Canon cameras. But you cannot turn off depth of field preview on the camera, which makes it so that if you're trying to use AFC with the aperture closed down, it makes it unusable to use. And other cameras don't do that. I tried my Panasonic G7, which is another mirrorless camera, and this camera has no problems autofocusing with the aperture closed down or whatever, because it just autofocuses with the aperture open. Because if you have the aperture open, that means the camera is getting much light as possible, and with that light, it can autofocus way easier than you would if you had the aperture closed down. It just like makes absolutely no sense why this is a thing. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a way of turning this off. But from what I seen, I did a lot of research online, and people are just like, yep, there is no way to turn off. You want to do studio photography, then Sony is not the brand for you. And doing studio photography is a big part of doing professional photography, and for some reason Sony has completely discarded that. And if you're using any Canon mirrorless cameras, you can turn off the depth of field preview, so that's not a problem. Or if you're using any of like mirrored cameras, then it keeps the aperture open anyway, so that you can see out of the viewfinder of the camera. And depending on the Sony camera you're using, this might not be an issue for you, because the autofocus of these cameras have gotten so good that even though it is closing down the aperture on the camera, it can still autofocus using it. For example, if you're shooting with the Sony a7 III, that camera has really good autofocus that even in a dimly lit studio at f11, you'll be able to autofocus. But if you're shooting with something like an a7R III, which is a more expensive camera, this camera actually has half the autofocusing points as the a7 III, so this camera does struggle a little bit when you're shooting in a dimly lit studio. But if you're using something older like the a7, the original a7 right here, this camera has a lot of problems trying to autofocus in the studio, and I always have to use AFS when I'm shooting with this. With this camera, I can usually get away with using AFC, but sometimes if it gets later in the day, we don't get a lot of natural light into our studio, then it does become harder. But again, if you're using a7 III, you can get away with it. a7R4 does sometimes struggle, and I'm sure if you have the a7 S3 or the A1, then those cameras can shoot fine. But the thing is that it's still gonna make the camera work harder to gain autofocus, and it is gonna slow it down. I'm hoping Sony releases a firmware update that lets you disable the depth of field preview. Some people might need it, but just give us the option of using it or not using it, so that it doesn't ruin the autofocus of our cameras. Anyways guys, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully it was helpful to you, because I know this is something I have struggled with for a while now, and I know other photographers have struggled with it and they just didn't know why their camera was not autofocusing. But that is the reason. So if you're struggling with it, try to open up the aperture of the camera a little bit. try not to go past f8, because apparently if you go past f8, then it starts using contrast detect autofocus besides phase detect. So try not to go above 7.1 would be my recommendation to you. And if it's still having problems, go from AFC to AFS in autofocus. That way, because if you're using AFS, it initially gains the autofocus with the aperture open and then closes back up, so you can use AFS for better results. But anyways guys, thanks for watching this video. I make videos every single week, month, whenever I feel like it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.